Good morning, everyone. I assume it's morning for everyone. If not, good day. Welcome to session 7AA, COBOL, How Old School Became New Age. Thanks to GSE for the opportunity to talk to you today. Thanks for joining the session. Thank you, Stuart, for hosting. So this session is about COBOL. And as the abstract says, COBOL's reputation as a trusted enterprise technology remains the topic of some public debate, I'm sure you've seen. And this session, using some recent research I just want to share with you, offers what I objectively believe to be the truth about COBOL and how it continues to underpin the global economy. My name is Derek Britton, and for the avoidance of doubt, yes, I am a COBOL fan. So how objective my truth is, well, I'll leave that to you to decide. Now, I'm a member of the Open Mainframe Project COBOL Working Group, which I'll explain in a bit more detail later on. I work for Micro Focus, who are a COBOL vendor, among other things. And one or two of you might have heard me chat about COBOL in the past at GSE or Share or elsewhere. I also wrote a paper a couple of years ago in celebration of COBOL's 60th anniversary. So, like I say, how objective this truth is, you decide. But let's take that journey together, shall we? Enough about me, for sure. So let's get to the task at hand. Let's set our dramatic scene, if you like. Our discussion today asks how COBOL went from this to this. From monochrome to color, from dull to bright. How did COBOL beat all of the odds and remain so important for so long? And to do that, we are going to have a little look back behind us in the past, but also reveal some new market data, as I've just mentioned, that's only recently emerged, which I think will help us answer the question definitively. Right, so get us there. We will take a little journey using this agenda. We'll ask why COBOL still matters. We'll try to look at how you can actually measure the value of a computer language. And before I finish with some suggestions for you all, we'll talk really quickly about COBOL's credentials as a new age technology, whatever that means. So for many of you COBOL fans out there, some of this may feel familiar. For the rest of you, I hope this will at least shine a light on what I think is a very, very important topic, at the very least, and something for you to consider to take away. And while you're here, here's a free gift. I love cartoons. Here's a new cartoon for you, a COBOL cartoon. I think it's hilarious, and I think it beats the Dilbert one about dinosaurs, which I'm sure you've seen far too often in the past. Now, speaking of dinosaurs, let's unpick this term, old school. And old is the word, isn't it? Old sepia photographs, black and white photographs, underscore a very cliched image of COBOL, one of a past tense technology. Who's not seen this kind of imagery? It's an old idea, isn't it? Forgotten systems that no one uses anymore. As outdated, perhaps, as the fashion worn by some of those seen in the stock photography. I'm sure someone in the crowd will know the name of this particular machine on the left-hand side, but not many of us. And I imagine that they'll be, quite, well, let's say, experienced to know the age of that machine and what it's called, to reinforce that stereotype. Only baby boomers, after all, would be drawn to such imagery. Only those nearing retirement will care about such an antiquated technology, and so on. That's basically what you get, isn't it, if you read the press about COBOL. And even the better funded, even the more enlightened IT press will often wheel out a dusty old picture and imply that COBOL is basically stuck in the past or moribund. That's the angle. Dusty old COBOL stops the world moving forward. And yet the reality of COBOL's power and prevalence and applicability is actually a far cry, isn't it, from this sort of lazy stock photography metaphor. And many of you will doubtless know this. And if you're at this COBOL session, my hope is that you have some affinity with the language. But it's worth restating all the same. Now, COBOL is, as a language, now in its 7th decade of loyal service, as I'm sure many of you know. By my calculations, it's 62 years old. The term was first coined in September 1959. And since then, it's become in widespread use as a core IT business systems language, as we all know. A few statements that might help remind us, though. Hopefully help us tear up that sort of dusty image metaphor. So it's in place, it's still in place at tens of thousands of organizations worldwide, across a variety of industries, many of which are written here. They're all vital to the global economy. COBOL is used to build systems for grown-ups. It's grown-up computing, isn't it? It's the important stuff. And last estimates put it at hundreds of billions of lines of application code. We'll come back to that stat in a bit more detail. Another interesting stat, though, is it remains, according to those who use it, overwhelmingly strategic to the organizations who have it, with a 92% response rate agreeing with that statement. 92% saying that it's strategic to that organization. Worth noting, if you didn't know, COBOL was designed by an independent authority. It's not owned by anybody. So you could perhaps argue that it's one of the first open projects of its kind, long before anyone considered the term open source, of course. So let's make that point just a tiny bit clearer, just so that we can definitively state that there's nothing wrong with old school. COBOL it's a global language. I've got some stats that tell us that there are scores of countries in which COBOL is active and widespread. And when it turned 60 years old a couple of years ago, I've got some stats on that. There were 100 separate industry articles, IT trade press articles published on the topic, within the space of a few months. Articles and social chatter that created something like 5 million impressions. And since then, the COBOL user group on Facebook, which is not a place you would traditionally associate with COBOL, has risen to a membership of 22,000 members, more than doubling in the last couple of years. So widespread usage, but also growing in popularity. And here's the thing. This is the key point. If COBOL stopped working overnight, so would great swathes of the global economy. And many people have said that before, but it remains not only true, but a very significant statement that a world without COBOL would be practically unthinkable. But if we ask that question, is old school cool? Does COBOL get a positive perspective as a result of its importance? And the answer is pretty clear. No, absolutely not. It's a big fat no. And in fact, it's kind of worse than that. Remember, there are many, many technologies that have come since COBOL. In fact, COBOL predates practically everything, doesn't it? It even predates the mainframe, after all. Now, all of those new technologies think they're equally as good, or they do something better or different in a better way. So a lot of the issue is that no one really talks about COBOL anymore anyway, or at least that's partially the concern. In reality, the popular reputation is that it is a bit dusty and it's not what cool kids use. And that's quite an easy target because it's not really there to defend itself. Plenty of vendors or technologists or so-called experts would prefer to replace it with their own suggestions, something newer, something different. So much so, in fact, that as you can see here, the disparaging comments started as far back as 1960, and they haven't really stopped since. I'm sure many of us can remember Dijkstra's quotes, of course, which is To say unkind is an understatement. In fairness, in the same paper, he was equally scathing about half a dozen other programming languages, but nonetheless, the damage was done. And of course, we probably can also recall more clearly the recent commentary where COBOL was thrown under the bus of technology progress as a result of its perceived lack of ability to support the pandemic. Haters are going to hate, I suppose. The problem is this is damaging to its reputation. But criticism is somewhat the price of ambition. And in fact, if you were to plot COBOL's journey, as I've tried to do here, at least in a sort of superficial way, you'd be looking at quite a few key milestones, at least in terms of public perception, but only a few parts of which are necessarily positive. And I'm not talking here about the milestones that maybe some of us COBOL technicians are aware of, years such as 1968, 74, 85, even 2002. In reality, they should be considered as well. But by the way, if you don't know what those dates are for, then we can talk and have another session later. No, I'm talking about where it makes the press, where COBOL meets the public eye, which interestingly is not all that often, because in reality, when COBOL never breaks, there's nothing to report. And no news, at least in IT terms, is generally good news. But certainly there were fears, weren't there, if you can recall this far back, that it might break in the run-up to the year 2000. I'm sure many of us can remember that. And subsequently, about 20 years later, there were fears that it had broken something or that it was breaking. Supporting the pandemic, stories of COBOL not being able to cope with the processing requirements at the time. It made the press. It turned out to be total nonsense, of course, but nonetheless, once it's reported, it's reported. Now, by contrast, and I wanted to put this here, the anniversary in 2019 was equally important because it saw some of the diehards, some of the proponents of COBOL make a little bit of noise, which was also fairly widely reported in the press, as I've mentioned earlier on, which helped galvanize the community, I think. It lit a beacon for many of us to start what was to become a more vocal COBOL community. Speaking of which, on the back of that pandemic discussion, where COBOL got the blame, I won't name names, but various people accused COBOL of not being able to cope with the demands of the processing requirements to do with dealing with the pandemic. But COBOL wasn't at fault at all. It sparked a genuine reaction by a number of people in the wider COBOL community, a reaction from those who I think believed the truth to be a different version of reality and wanted that story to be told, which is the point where the COBOL working group came into being. Now, as we know, COBOL's age means a lot of its, poor reputation is an urban myth, accepted wisdom that, based on the fact that something so old can't be viable anymore. So here's what happened. It was that this COBOL working group was founded by members of the COBOL community. So who do I mean? Well, university professors, people who work for vendors, COBOL practitioners, people who code COBOL every day, former CIOs. The group was set up in a fairly neutral zone of the Open Mainframe project, which gave it a sort of a place to incubate, where you left your day job at the door and you came in and spoke freely and equally. They set themselves up to tell the truth about COBOL, to restate its value, to remind people of its popularity and its usage. So there was a clearer understanding of the technology, so that things that were being incorrectly reported could be addressed. and that there was greater balance in terms of what got said. Now, we already mentioned billions of lines of production code earlier on. Not an easy thing to measure, as I'm sure you would understand. Importantly, the last estimate of that figure was quite a long time ago, somewhere around the 1990s. And so as one of its first tasks, the COBOL working group, which it sought to define an objective truth about COBOL, decided that the first thing to do was to get a more up-to-date view on just how much COBOL there is. And that's what they did. So earlier this year, after a while of deliberating on how best to do it, the Open Mainframe Project COBOL Market Survey took place. So to cut through, what you would want to fully quantify, they determined that the best way to measure something so widespread is to look at, is to get as much of it documented as possible. And the best way to do that is to use, obviously, the internet, using a neat and simple online survey process to get as much input as they could possibly gather. And bearing in mind, this is a not-for-profit organization, so there's not much funding behind it. So simple surveying seemed to be a sensible approach. It was about getting as many voices as we could, learning about key trends, and also get a sense of how much code there was out there. Now, hundreds of responses later, and with a little bit of science woven into then projecting based on that sample, the results were produced. Let's take a quick look, shall we? And this is where I kind of want to leave the slide up for a while, because I want you just to take stock of this. Now, I mentioned earlier on, didn't I, 240 billion was the estimate in the 1990s. And some people could, arguably, perhaps justifiably, have expected the amount of COBOL out there to have ebbed away over time as people moved away from COBOL, as the inexorable path towards other technology continued. That's just not true. The data from this era, 2021, and quite an important finding, and while all the caveats apply, the COBOL working group is calling 250 billion lines of code out there today. So that's 250 billion versus 240, 25 years ago. So no one was quite sure how real the estimate was in the 90s, or whether since it had slipped away. It seems like this stuff hasn't slipped away at all, and if anything, it appears to have grown. And where is it? Well, the sectors giving us the most data in response, and in fact, those representing the most code, were in financial services, in government, and also, interestingly, in the software industry itself, and elsewhere too, as you can see. I'm showing a pie chart here for financial services in particular. And you'll notice here, and for illustration, you're noticing a proportion of them have significant footprints of COBOL, over a billion lines of code in a single organization wasn't uncommon, and of course it could be far greater than that. And critically, with an eye on the future, the group also asked about the likely continued usage of those COBOL applications. And there were a few questions around this, but a key data point here is that well over half the responses across all sectors are saying that the applications are here to stay for at least 5 years, if not 10 years or more. A major future reliance on COBOL is the answer in the majority of cases. And again, you can see here financial services in the pie chart. I think this illustrates the future importance of COBOL to those industries where it matters the most, where the lifespan is even longer, at least 10 years in this particular case, in the majority of responses, which is pretty telling. No signs of it ebbing away at all. And finally, on a related topic of the future, what about, and it's often a question that I hear, what about do we have the right number of people to continue to support those COBOL systems? Well, the skills challenge is real. Let's not kid ourselves. But this is an interesting data slice. The blue line here is those who see a skills challenge today. We've split this here by the size of the organization that responded to get a better view of, whether it's to do with organization size or team size, and not so much. Interestingly, the very, very largest and the very, very smallest organizations have more of a challenge with skills access. And maybe it's just the scale, but they project a challenge in the future. It seems to suggest that COBOL continues to be used, but the need to train future COBOL staff remains a vital question. It's not something, it's not a great surprise to most of us. We probably already knew this. But of course, importantly, worth stressing here, this is not an issue that is specific or unique to COBOL itself. It's a general point about technical skills. Now, I can't cover the survey in enough detail on this call. There are sessions available where we can walk through that, but also the Tech Channel IT publication. There's an online article that takes you through the full detail of the survey results, and I'll get you that link later on. So that's one body of evidence and a major breakthrough, and we have the Open Mainframe Project team to thank, which includes, by the way, a number of people who are also members of GSE. Now, roughly at the same time, another study was being devised, and I want to bring you information about that. A key difference here is that study has a bit more, shall we say, support behind it, and a bit more science as well, because they're using market research experts, Banson Bourne, who were invited to help devise the survey and the questions and ensure that the responses were correctly screened and duplications removed, that kind of thing. And it's been sponsored by Micro Focus, who regularly surveys the COBOL market. Now, this survey, I just want to say, this survey is still open. So I can't give you the full results here, but I also know that several hundred responses have already been received from across 40 countries, across a wide variety of technology platforms. So it's worth a quick look, and I can tell you, let me tell you what I can. So I'm under strict instructions not to reveal too much. I'll get told off otherwise. I do work for Micro Focus, but I don't own this survey. If you want to know more, there was a preliminary initial results preview webinar in October. And the full and final results, I think, will be published in early 2022. But here's what I can share. While responses are from across the range in terms of platforms, no surprise to any of us, of course, the vast majority of the applications in question are from, are mainframe based, but not exclusively. It's no secret, of course, about COBOL being a great choice for mainframe systems, but it's not exclusive. COBOL can work, frankly, anywhere. Additionally, something else being asked and tested was the confidence level in the respondents' estimate of their code base. What's interesting here is that 83% are confident in their estimate in terms of the accuracy of the amount of code that they're predicting. Or put another way, we believe the results to be accurate within a 17% margin of error. And that's quite an important consideration, just how accurate are the estimates of how much code there is, because of course no one's actually counting these things by hand. What we already know from the data is that the total line of code count, based on the samples so far, this is very, very likely to far exceed the recent OMP survey estimate. So it's likely to be far in excess of 250 billion lines of code, by some distance, in fact. And I think that would be effectively rewriting the story in terms of the enduring and crucially growing usage and importance of the COBOL language. I can't say any more than that, but it is an intriguing and an enticing future stat to look forward to. And I'm sure you won't want to miss the final results when they come out early next year. Now, speaking of which, if you want to learn any more about any of those details, and it's not really my place to try and describe it all here today, except to mention their existence. The Open Mainframe Project's findings have been published as a set of commentary. The special report at the top is the one where we go into detail about the survey results themselves, but the links are all here. And then the Micro Focus Vance and Bourne survey, which is still open. The early findings webinar link is there as well, while the survey itself is still open if you haven't already taken it. So when you get access to this these slides, you'll be able to follow the link. Now, given potentially profound importance of the study, I urge you to get involved with the Vance and Bourne study if you possibly can.
On that point then, so is there any eligibility criteria, or is it open to any curious individual?
Anyone who presides over any COBOL is welcome to join, and there will be a number of screening questions to then test eligibility. But basically, yeah, if you work for an organization that has COBOL, then go for it.
There you are then, audience. Something to fill in the time between GSE sessions.
That's right. It's 20 questions. It won't take you long. Okay, so let's move on. So, okay, if that's some evidence that suggests the continued importance of the language, I would contend that it is clearly living in the new age. But I spoke last year at this conference, the GSE conference, and elsewhere, about COBOL's design principles that have helped it evolve, because it still begs the question, how has it lasted so long? And I've summarized them here simply to remind us that a fundamentally sensible design, even as far back as 1959, helped it endure as a language. These quotes are actually from the original language specification. And as a result, the COBOL that you know today excels in some, really key attributes, including, I don't know, what would you say? Number crunching, data centricity, readability, portability, adaptability. There are few languages for business that can boast all of these attributes. Very few indeed, in fact. I've tried reading some newer languages. I go back to COBOL. Now, as a result of that adaptability, remember COBOL predates everything else, pretty much. And that constant modernization of the language and the applications that it supports. Now, whether that's thanks to the standards bodies implementing, updates to the COBOL language, or to the vendors building, updates of the COBOL compiler technology, or indeed other vendors who, building the tools around it. This page just reads like a taxonomy of modern computing. Like I say, COBOL predated, but then adapted to support all of this. Plus the things that we haven't mentioned here, the mainframe systems themselves, databases, object orientation listed there, etc., etc. With each passing year, another trend, another exciting innovation goes mainstream, and we find, out of necessity, COBOL supports that too. Thanks to the continued innovation from the wider COBOL community and vendor community. A case in point example, well, VS Code. You can't move for VS Code being mentioned these days as the very latest in IDE developments, already supported for COBOL, already available through various vendor offerings with their own examples. This one that you see here is from Micro Focus. Other options are available, of course. But if VS Code doesn't matter, maybe that's not your thing. Maybe you're an Eclipse person or an ISPF person. COBOL should work wherever you need it, after all. That's fine too. And what else? Well, anywhere in the cloud, of course. That's been done for some time, including, of course, Z or Z, however you want to pronounce it. Any containers, microservices? The answer is yes. The answer for COBOL to survive, the answer always has to be yes before the question gets asked. And that's what COBOL has done again and again and again over the decades. Of course, being a modern language is about the people as well as the technology. So more and more efforts we've noticed in terms of online training, open source courseware, serving up COBOL tutorials and training courses to an increasingly younger COBOL community. Now that Facebook group I mentioned has more members aged 20 to 30 than any other age group, which is not what you would traditionally associate with a body of COBOL programmers. And perhaps to seal the point, COBOL, remember that dusty old language that no one uses anymore, is still remains in the top 25 languages in terms of popularity, according to the TOB index, which you can look up online. In fact, COBOL has never left the charts since the charts began in the early 80s, I think it was. The evidence is there if you choose to read it. COBOL is new age. It always was. It just still is. Which, of course, I know you would expect me to say. Full confession. I said I was a COBOL fan. I was bound to tell you that. But actually, you should believe that too. As members of the COBOL community, you should be saying it to everyone else. It's what I've been doing, and I invite you to share in that journey. So this is where you come in. Do yourself a favor at the same time as doing me a favor. Read the links I've sent. See for yourself this data that I've mentioned. 2021 data that says unequivocally about COBOL's continued importance and prevalence. See what that means for you and for your organization. And use that data, use that knowledge to fight back against tired cliches. Don't accept black and white photographs. Don't allow idle bias about COBOL's age damage its contemporary value, because it's untrue and it's unfair. And join the growing community, vocal community of COBOL proponents. Get yourselves involved and set the record straight. I think the time is now. So for those of you on Twitter, have some fun with this. Let's use our time productively. Let's all tweet this line on the screen here. I'm going to go and do it right now. I have my Twitter client open in my other window. I'm sending it right now. Hundreds of billions of reasons to love COBOL at GSE UKC. If you're on Twitter now, use your time. Off you go. Have some fun with it. Now, I'm sure you get the point. There are hundreds of billions of reasons to see COBOL as part of the new age, because it's wired in to how the economy continues to function because of its importance. It's our job to remind everybody of that truth. And I'll be back next year to remind you again, I hope. Now, with that, I'm happy to pass it over and take any questions.
If anyone pop anything in the chat, or just looking for the opportunity, can we let people come off mute? Anyone does have any questions, please put them into the chat. And from Wendy Wilson.
Go ahead, Wendy.
think I've just asked you to unmute. I think that you can now unmute if you want to ask a question directly. Yeah, Wendy, you should be audible. That's it.
Hi. Just my only question is, on the survey, how on those figures, they're huge, how are you ensuring that the same companies aren't answering the same questions?
Yeah, that's a great question, Wendy. And in fairness, one of the things that I'm just trying to go back to these links here. One of the things that you will find about the Open Mainframe Project survey is that we we had to take a lot of the information in to begin with, and then start looking at how many people from the same organization had commented, and then within that organization, how many from the same business unit. We didn't want the same code being counted twice. It would probably be fair to say that the Open Mainframe Project, remember, it's run by volunteers. They did their very best to deduplicate, input that appeared to be, coming from the same place. Whereas Vance and Bourne, who have years of experience of running this kind of industry survey, have a much more exacting scientific screening process. And it's interesting that the Vance and Bourne results look like they're finding more code. So even with the deduplication process going on and greater screening going on, it looks like the numbers are actually still very, very significant, even with those controls in place. But the methodology, if you like, is explained in the report for the Open Mainframe Project survey in the article. And I know that Vance and Bourne will talk about their methodology when the results are announced as well. As we're very, in both organizations, very, very mindful that what you don't want to do is pick a big number that you can't stand behind. And of course, all of these are based on some projection. That's a great question, Wendy. Thanks.
Thank you.
I mean, probably just to reinforce that Stuart's point there, is the more data we can collect, the more accurate the results can be. And that's true for any survey. And if there are tens of thousands of organizations using COBOL, we want, the closer you can get to a fair percentage, a large percentage of that actual number that respond, the better it would be. But of course, no market survey is 100% coverage.
There is another question in the chat from Les Charles. Are there any conversions from COBOL that do not result in problems?
Any conversions from COBOL that do not result in problems?
Yeah, I'm guessing that's code converting to Java or taking it off host or something. Yeah, refactoring it rather.
Well, if it's a question to someone who works for a vendor who would dispute the wisdom of doing that. So of course I'm going, my caveat is, as far as I'm concerned, I don't think that's a very good thing to do anyway. And in fact, part of the challenge with moving away from COBOL is that the perceived, the perceived solution of moving away from COBOL is a bit of a sledgehammer to crack a nut. What can often happen is that COBOL applications have become monolithic in their structure over time, and what the organization might be looking to do is make those applications more service-oriented or at least more flexible in how they can be used and reused going forward. Moving to another language doesn't actually necessarily get you any further along that path. Whereas COBOL itself can be re-examined, re-evaluated, and code sliced, or using whatever engineering principles you want to create a more service oriented or microservice based architecture, if that's what the IT strategy needs to be. I happen to know there are some organizations that think that a COBOL conversion to another language would be relatively straightforward, but then of course a lot depends on the nature of the application being converted, and where it's going and how it's going to fit alongside and integrate with other parts of the wider ecosystem. I would suggest that conversions from COBOL do not result in problems. I think the very fact that you think you need to convert away from COBOL means that there is a problem, and the problem is the perception of the applications.
I think as well, Derek, that if organisations think about how much it's going to cost to refactor, unless there's it no longer works on the mainframe. If they thought about spending that same money on doing what you just said, refactoring, perhaps making it less monolithic, easier to test, or make amendments to, then perhaps they have the right application anyway. So it's not always about making it better with something more modern. It's perhaps just the investment in removing some of that technical debt.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Most of the accepted wisdom about leapfrogging or from COBOL into something new technology is because they don't understand what's possible with COBOL today. That all of those things could be done from COBOL, but the level of technical debt and the level of appreciation of what is possible in COBOL as it stands is not clear. Back to the point about this community being as vocal as it can be about what is possible, and talking about COBOL as, you might not use this phrase, but as a new age language that it can do pretty much anything you need it to do. It's just a case of understanding what's possible with the technology, building from within, building on strength rather than replacing. I think there's a question here from Steve.
Yeah, hi Derek. Sorry, I arrived a little bit late, but one of my colleagues said this is a great presentation, so I've just been looking through the slides. But from the surveys that you did, or that you mentioned in the presentation, did you get an idea of the systems? Is there a new systems being built, or if COBOL's just still prevalent because it's just been there to support other applications, as in there's billions of lines of code? It's still prevalent because people have to change sort of one line of it in a system to make it work for a new system. Does that make sense?
Absolutely, it does. Yeah, there were some questions about in both surveys actually. Again, so the published survey and the Tech Channel article should give you some data points on this about what COBOL was being used for. Was it new application development or just maintenance? What I'm looking for, and I'm a bit of a purist when it comes to these things. If the market hasn't really been surveyed for how much COBOL there is for 25 years, and we can come up with a body of evidence that says, and what is it the pollsters do? They do a poll of polls. So if we average out the total amount of code based on the surveys, we have a good baseline. So it would be nice to not wait 25 more years to then survey the market to see how much COBOL has grown. And that will tell us a little bit more about how much change there is, by volume at least. So, at a sort of meta level, that's the question I'd like to answer, I must admit, Steve. But I think one of, to your point, both surveys have asked what is the COBOL being used for, new application development versus maintenance. So we do have those answers, or rather, there's one of the surveys has the answers, and one of the surveys will have that answer when it publishes.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's a sort of anecdotal type experience, isn't it? And I know at our site we looked at the numbers and we see 10% of our base changing on a yearly period. So when we looked at that, we haven't looked at it that closely, but that seems to be sort of change to the existing applications. We're not seeing new builds. We see everything, new systems being cloud first, either on or off premises. And the data on the back end then needs to be connected to, as in remotely or API or ZOS Connect, as in, the mainframe still is the server with the data on it, and it's seen as that sort of piece. So there's potentially less COBOL in the future because of the new ways of connecting through to it and talking to it that way. But I guess our figures will sort of maybe go down a little bit. So COBOL still being used, but being changed less is sort of the idea.
Yeah, well, of course, once COBOL becomes a more, or rather, once the use of COBOL becomes a more service-based, discrete set of callable functions, then theoretically it creates more efficient code over time. And so, your layer cake then becomes more reusable. So you don't have to write new code. You don't have to undergo heroic deeds to create new functions the whole time. Or so the theory goes. That said, it probably means that then there are other use cases or other business opportunities that can then be explored instead, because we're also so much more efficient. Now, it feels like I'm painting a fairly utopian model of the future. But nonetheless, that is, aspirationally where a number of organizations are headed. There are large, very, very large organizations that I can point at in the US that their code base has not dropped. What's happened is they've actually, found the time to innovate and move into new lines of business and do different things with the code. And they are exploring things like cloud and container architectures to exploit those opportunities. But what they're typically doing is using tried and trusted COBOL functions, but then reimagining it to act in different ways. And so new code is being developed, as well as some existing code being reused. And I think there's always going to be that blend. And of course, it's a bit of a gray area to determine what's new versus what's maintenance, because a lot of what COBOL is doing and a lot of the core functionality and what it's good for are the sort of fairly trusted reusable functions in many cases, whether it's data manipulation or calculations. There's a lot of things that you can reuse and reuse again, of course, depending on the organization.
You picked up on a great point there. I do see a massive difference between the US businesses on the mainframe and the UK businesses or the Western businesses that are not the US. They have a very different business model. So you ask the same question of two companies based in those locations, and you'll get two very different answers. I think in the UK we've moved very much to a different model than the US, which has sort of kept it sort of I guess back to its 1960s model of this is exactly how we did things before, and we're just continuing to go in that direction. Whereas in the UK we've moved completely forward with things as you've sort of mentioned in your presentation.
Yeah, and I mean even within organizations, we'll find, that certainly the larger multinationals will have different approaches, different technical strategies, even though foundationally it's still mainframe COBOL, but the how they're embracing the future is being managed in slightly different ways, depending on where in the organization you happen to sit. So yeah. It's an interesting feast. I don't suppose that the future world is going to be any less complex for us to manage. But I think the important thing is that there's no reason to move away from COBOL just because of its age, and that's a story that we collectively still need to be able to tell.
Yeah. Thanks very much.
Okay, back to you, Stuart.
Yeah. So the hyperlink there, COBOL Market Survey link, if anyone does want to join. And I don't know, do you briefly want to flash up your hashtag message, Derek? I did see it on your Twitter feed, and I have posted something similar myself.
Yeah. There you go, guys. I'm sure you're all avid Twitter users, and if not, you can have some fun and promote GSE at the same time, who frankly deserve a lot of credit for this session and for the rest of the conference. And COBOL, I'm pleased to say, is going to be mentioned more than once during the course of the GSE conference. So I look forward to seeing some of you on some of the other sessions by Micro Focus and other vendors, of course, during the rest of the conference. So thanks very much.
Actually on the Open Mainframe project, the COBOL training course there, that I know lots of people of all ages go through. I see the traffic on the Slack channel for it. It's definitely capturing people's imagination, and I think people do look at the mainframe now as a genuine opportunity for a career. Going to maintain some of this COBOL, redeveloping it, etc. It's good that companies that are trying to recruit, on your chart of the ages there, that there are people coming out of college all over the world that want to go and work on the mainframe. It's a good time. So thank you very much, Derek. To everyone else that's attended, thank you. GSE now goes on for the rest of today and tomorrow and Thursday, and then there's 3 days next week. So enjoy the sessions, and the session was 7AA. If you want to provide some feedback, we'd very much appreciate that. So session 7AA. Thank you very much. Have a good day.